Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, your go-to source for unpacking the complexities of the South African energy sector. My name is Thokozile Zambane. I will be your guide, and every 2 weeks, we will be on a journey of bridging the knowledge gap surrounding South Africa's energy sector and the transition to a low-carbon economy. Welcome back to the Energy Conversations podcast, where we break down the complexities of the South African energy sector into digestible insights. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and in today's episode titled Understanding Electricity Pricing, we aim to unpack how electricity pricing in South Africa is determined, as well as the factors that impact electricity prices in South Africa. I'm excited to have three seasoned energy experts joining us for this conversation. Dr. Bongani Khonjelwayo, Energy Planning Advisor at Empower, Frank Hinda, Senior Manager Pricing and Tariffs at City Power, and Nhlanhla Ngidi, Head of Energy and Electricity Distribution at SALGA. The South African electricity supply industry is transitioning from a historically vertically integrated model towards an unbundled Eskom and an environment with independent generators supplying customers and trading independent of Eskom. Eskom remains responsible for all transmitted electricity as they are the only licensee, and the responsibility for distribution is currently shared between Eskom, municipalities, and other distributors. In this episode, we seek to unpack electricity pricing. Before we dig into today's episode, I think it would be important to begin with some introductions. Dr. Bongani, if I can begin with you, please.
Thanks, Thokozile. So, yes, I currently work for I just started recently as an energy sector planning advisor. It's an Empower Southern Africa. Before then, I worked at the National Energy Regulator of South Africa in the electricity pricing and tariffs department, which was part of the electricity regulation division. I worked there as a senior analyst responsible for, amongst others, setting and approving tariffs for Eskom through the retail tariff and structural adjustment methodology, and as well as setting tariffs for various municipal distributors. As you did mention, that we have about 176 distributors in South Africa. So that's where I worked for 7 years up until the end of March. And previously I worked at Eskom in various capacities within the group capital division, which is responsible for building Medupi, Igosile, and other new build projects. Thanks, Thokozile.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Bongani. Frank, if you could briefly share what your current role is in the energy sector.
Yes, good afternoon to you and to my colleagues and to the viewers. I'm Frank Hinda. I'm from City Power, where I'm the senior manager responsible for pricing and tariffs, meaning that I'm involved in the process of setting the tariffs. I'm involved in the process of making sure that the tariffs are sustainable and are affordable. I'm also responsible for ensuring that there is alignment between the City Power cost structure and the tariff structure to ensure that the costs are recovered where they are incurred. I've been in this role for about 7 years. Before that, I've also been with NERSA, where I was also involved in the electricity pricing department, where we were responsible for setting of pricing and tariffs for Eskom and all the municipalities in the country, where I spent about 5 years. Before that, I've been involved with the EDI Holdings, which was responsible for restructuring the electricity distribution industry in the country.
Thank you very much, Frank. Nhlanhla, if you could briefly share about your role in the energy sector.
Thank you very much, Thokozile. Again, my name is Nhlanhla Ngidi. I am currently the head of energy and electricity distribution in SALGA. I am leading various, reform initiatives that are currently taking place in the sector. One of them being the just energy transition, and looking also at the reform of the electricity distribution industry with more emphasis to municipalities. So my major roles is to influence policies and ensure that we take the policies, the energy policies in the right direction where electricity is concerned, obviously making sure that municipalities are protected, or their powers are protected. So I'm more like a super consultant to municipalities, if you might, because I'm a person that they expect a lot of answers to on many and various issues, be it tariffs, be it the issues of planning, be it the issues of policy and regulations, and many other technical issues. So I've got 25 years in experience in the industry. My experience goes back to also working for the regulator for about 8 or 9 years. And I've worked for various utilities in municipalities, and also including being a trainee engineer at Eskom as well.
Thank you very much for that, Nhlanhla. To kick off, I'd like us to begin with an understanding of the calculation of the true cost of electricity. Dr. Bongani, if I can bring you in here, what are the methodologies that are used to calculate the true cost of electricity generation?
Thanks, Thokozile, for that question. So, electricity generation is and distribution as well as transmission is costed and priced according to the requirements of the Electricity Regulation Act. So the Act requires that licenses must be able to recover the costs of their license activities, and they must also be able to earn a return or markup from these activities. So basically, in terms of how we regulate Eskom, there is a methodology that is referred to as a multi-year price determination, which is a rate of return methodology. This framework then allows Eskom to recover the costs of its license activity and then earn a return on assets. And for municipalities, we use an approach that is aligned to a revenue cap. So in other words, then the regulator sets revenues that distributors need to recover from distributing electricity, which includes the bulk purchases from Eskom. As you know, that most of them buy electricity from Eskom and then redistribute to their customer. So that is a basic premise around the pricing of electricity. So Eskom will come to NERSA and say they will require so much in terms of being able to generate and transmit electricity, looking at their operating and maintenance costs, and then that would then translate into a cents per kilowatt hour price, which for 24-25 financial year is R1.95. So, but that it doesn't end there. So tariffs are also designed not just to recover costs, but they're also designed to send signals to customers to then behave in a certain manner. A typical example is the time of use tariffs. So which time of use would then charge different tariffs based on the time consumers typically use electricity. And the intention then is to encourage customers shift their consumption towards cheaper to do so, or where there's less demand. So typically your time of use tariffs will then, for instance, Eskom's time of use tariffs are that when you consume during the winter peak, you will pay 8 times more than when you consume during summer of peak. So it's a balancing of cost recovery vis-a-vis sending signals. We also have what we call IBT tariffs, which then would then split the consumption into certain components. That would then charge a higher a tariff for each block of consumption. But generally, generation costs are marginal. So they will increase with the amount of electricity that you will consume. So typically, a utility will start by generating using base load. And then when demand increases, they will use either mid-merit, which is a combination of peak and base load, and then eventually they'll use peaking, which is more expensive. So, but in South Africa, that's not how we charge customers in terms of the generation costs. They are generally charged that time of use, and not all customers have time of use tariffs. Typically, your large power users would then have time of use. So that's what makes up the cost. of generation, and therefore it gets translated into tariffs. But another big component around the costing and pricing of electricity is that about 60 to 70% of the costs of generating and supplying electricity are fixed. So they are not dependent on the amount of electricity that is being used. So, but when you look at the tariffs that are being charged currently, they are largely variable. So most of the customers, they are charged cents per kilowatt hour. So that cents per kilowatt hour does not just recover energy, but it also recovers other fixed costs like your generation fixed costs, such as the infrastructure that is there, your power plants, your transformers, your transmission distribution costs, such as your lines and all of that. So the challenge that we are facing now is that there's a mismatch between the costs that are there as well as the tariffs that are currently charged to consumers. And also there is to a certain extent the aligning of these costs to externalities, for instance, in terms of the environment. So currently we have an environmental levy that is being recovered through SARS. It's a tax. At some point they wanted to implement a carbon tax, but it was suspended. But the intention was then to align the generation costs as well as the tariffs to the externalities arising from the environment. But that does not cover all the issues around this in terms of the levelized cost of electricity. So when you look at, for instance, the solar energy, will then look at the whole life cycle of solar, including the decommissioning, the disposal of the assets. So that is not currently covered under the current pricing dispensation. So I think I would stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bongani. I'd like us to continue just unpacking and looking at these primary components that actually make up the cost of electricity in South Africa. Frank, I'm wondering if you can maybe just come in at this point and just unpack this and just crystallize it for South Africans in terms of, as a South African, what is it, or what are these components, or what are the primary components that are actually then at the end of the day making up the cost of electricity?
As my colleague has indicated, the electricity supply industry consists of three main elements: generation, transmission, and distribution. And that would then be what ends up making up the electricity price that you see being charged by Eskom and eventually by the distribution intermediaries that are there as well. Now, in terms of generation of electricity, the biggest contributor to the generation cost in most times is the primary energy cost, meaning that that's the fuel that is used to generate electricity. It can be coal, it can be nuclear, it can be jet fuel in the case of OCGTs, it can be water in the case of hydro, and obviously the cheapest form of fuel is generally tends to be, ranges between nuclear and of course, the hydro, water from a hydro point of view. And that is a biggest contributor of the generation cost, primary energy cost. But then generation also has got the fixed element. That's the plant. The plant that is, to put up a generation plant, it comes at significant cost, and that cost has to be recovered over the life of the generation plant. And then, of course, the operation of the generation plant. Those are the contributors primarily in the case of generation. In the case of transmission, the biggest contributor is, again, plant. In this case, the high voltage transmission lines that are used, because electricity is generally generated in Mpumalanga, while it's consumed all over the country, as far as coal is concerned. In the case of IPPs, it's mainly in the renewables, it's mainly in the Northern Cape. Wherever they are generated, it needs to be transported to where it has been consumed. Again, the infrastructure that goes with that is the biggest contributor to the cost. Therefore, because that cost of putting the transmission lines there has to be recovered again over the useful lives of the transmission lines, which make up the plan for a transmission operation. And of course, when this it needs to be operated, so the operators, the human resources that are involved in that, it's what contributes to the transmission cost. To an extent, it's a retail element, as some of the distributors source from the transmission part of the operations. So there is a retail element to that. And when it comes to distribution, which takes the electricity that is being transmitted over at high voltage, it gets stepped down to lower voltage. It then gets delivered to the distributor, which are entities like city power, like entities like municipalities, and ESCOM distribution, to mention a few. They are when they take that electricity, and when obviously they need to have plant as well. I mean, it mainly consisting of cables, networks, and it including the transmission plant that is been used in the distribution sector. And of course, it needs to be operated, and therefore the human resources and other operating costs, including maintenance of the infrastructure. And then the retail element of that, which is the buying and selling of electricity, mainly selling it to the customers, and also when sourcing it from ESCOM, which is the generator, it's the transmitter and the distributor in certain aspects. And of course, we also supply some of the distributors. Some of our supply is from transmission, but those are the elements that contribute primarily to the general cost of electricity supply.
Nhlanhla, I'd like to bring you in here and just bringing it down then to a municipal level. How do municipalities set electricity tariffs, and what factors are taken into account in considering these prices?
Thank you very much, Thokozile. I think maybe very fast, the first fundamental thing I want to say about especially distribution tariffs is at this point, the manner in which these are set is very much inefficient. The customers there at home, they must know that they are nowhere paying any close to what the tariff should be, because right now, the manner in which tariffs are set at distribution, they are not cost reflective. So the municipalities are at the receiving end of the value chain. The regulatory methodology that is being used now is not a methodology that is efficient, because it doesn't take into consideration the cost of doing business. Yes, it does consider a few components, which most of them, or the large percentage on the cost component would be because the municipalities, the manner in which the industry is vertically integrated, municipalities at this point in time are buying from ESCOM and ESCOM only, the power at a distribution level. And they are buying at that distribution price that is set by NESA for ESCOM. And all they need to do is to basically just offset that price that they are getting to the customer. And most of the cost component, as I said, the ESCOM bulk supply, it sits at more or less about 70% of the cost components of municipalities. And then the other cost component would be the human component itself, the annual increases, the O&M, and also, that 6% that is supposed to go to, the refurbishing or the management of the infrastructure. So as I said, the regulatory framework up until I think last year has been called a municipal benchmark framework. So we, as I said earlier, we are nowhere close to looking at tariffs, basing them at how much it costs to run the business. They are at a benchmark stage at this point in time. And that is why we have a court order that came out from, the case that was from the business chambers in the Eastern Cape, Nelson Mandela Bay. They were rendering the municipal benchmark tariff methodology as illegal, and that it doesn't really, it gives municipalities a lot of exponential profits without it being, very fair or efficient in terms of identifying the true cost of supplying or distributing electricity. So as we speak right now, that methodology has been rendered illegal. So it's not legal anymore for NERSA to use that kind of methodology. So NERSA had to be forced or was forced by this court order to develop a regulatory framework that is getting the tariffs much more closer to being cost reflective. So that regulatory framework is still under consultation process. So what has been done while that framework is being developed is temporarily NERSA and municipalities have been given a permission to sort of look at setting their tariffs using what you call a simple costing methodology that we have developed together with NERSA. So that simple costing methodology is trying to now getting very close to making input data that could get you close to having cost reflective tariffs. So that is what is being used in the interim while we're waiting for NERSA to approve the latest regulatory framework. And by the way, a framework that will be used by municipalities and ESCOM, because currently we have we have dual regulation when it comes to tariff regulatory framework. ESCOM until recently has been regulated using multi-year price determination. I'm sure you've seen in the past in the media when ESCOM is asking for certain percentage increases for the next 3 to 5 years, and that would be done through the multi-year price determination or what we call an MYPD. Then municipalities obviously at the receiving end with that benchmark tariff methodology. So now what NERSA is busy with is a methodology that will be used by all, because I think as SALGA also we have made some inputs around the unfairness of this dual regulation, where ESCOM is able to sometimes recoup some of the cost within this regulatory framework, which municipalities obviously do not have an opportunity to recoup. And I don't want to go further in terms of the MYPD of ESCOM, but this is where we are right now. I want to repeat this again. The court also ordered municipalities and ESCOM to submit cost of supply studies, and in order to actually come close to having a cost reflective tariffs. So these studies are now underway from municipalities and ESCOM. They are trying, I think at the very best, to quantify every cost that the municipalities absorb to run the electricity distribution department. And that will help them, or that kind of information will help them to be a greater input into getting a right rate or a right tariff for a municipality. So as I said, right now, electricity in South Africa is quite cheap. Yes, it has increased exponentially in the past 10 years due to ESCOM's increases, and municipalities had to offset that. But globally, we are still not sitting at top 10 in terms of the prices of electricity. We are sitting way below, because it means that our electricity is still pretty much very cheap. And with the energy transition that is happening right now in the country, and the market that is going to be in operation very soon, we're going to have a lot of international investors who are going to, by the way, to expect that prices would be at least par with what is happening globally. So customers might have to brace themselves for some form of increases to actually allow this market to actually take place, and also for this just energy transition to take place. Well, obviously at municipal level, there will be a lot of balancing acts that needs to be done, because municipalities are on the ground serving the people, the poor, the middle class, and the upper class. So a lot of balancing that happens in municipalities, and we in the industry, we call it cross-subsidization, where some of the revenue that is made on these trading services in municipalities is used to cross-subsidize the poor customers, and even cross-subsidize other services in municipalities that are not revenue generating. So yeah, this is the situation we're gonna have going into the future. It's going to be hard to strike a balance because the funding model has pretty much been, electricity is more like the cash cow in the municipality, and it's assisting all other services like your parks and recreation and many other services that are not generating revenue. So we are going towards a situation where that revenue model will have to change, but still, because we have socio-economic issues, there must be that balancing act that must take place in terms of protecting the poor customer from the rising prices of electricity that we might be experiencing in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and Nhlanhla, you really touched on a lot. And I think what becomes quite key is and again, it ties in with what Dr. Bongani was speaking about in terms of in the methodology for determining electricity prices. It really key to that is cost recovery, which has then been echoed by what you're saying, in that we then should be getting to a situation where a tariff or whatever tariff is then being paid is actually cost reflective. And you know, to your point of what you're saying, that if currently tariffs that are then being paid by South Africans are then actually not being cost reflective because it's taking into account other service delivery matters that municipalities need to take into account, it then becomes quite important that you know, we've had judgments like you've spoken about to really ensure that we are not any electricity prices and potential increases then are not to the detriment to your average South African. Dr. Bongani, you touched on costs that are associated with renewable energy, and I think it also speaks to the just transition and the implications then of increased foreign investment into South Africa. How would you say, or how do cost structures where, you know, around renewable energy, how do those compare to cost structures taking into account or looking at non-renewable energy sources, and how do those directly influence electricity pricing in South Africa?
Thanks, Togo, for the question. So, what we've seen is that over the years is that, so from a utility point of view, that is from Eskom's point of view, as you know, that we've had several rounds of renewable energy. So if you look at MYPD3 between 2013 and 2017, the proportion of renewable energy into Eskom's cost structure was sitting at around 2%. So currently it's sitting at over 20%. So it's been one of the cost drivers from a point of view of Eskom's total cost structure, in a sense that, first of all, the first two windows were quite high in terms of the bid prices for renewable and wind, but then later on the prices went down. But what has been happening is that as those plants get commissioned and start commercial operating, then that cost structure then gets pulled through to the Eskom cost structure because they recover their cost through the Eskom tariff. So that has increased over the years. So it's one of the cost items that have increased proportionally between, let's say, MYPD3, MYPD4, and MYPD5. But customers then would only see a blended price. So they will see a price that is made up of coal, renewable energy, and all those cost items. So there's no clear separation at the end user side of the renewable component of that price. But if you look at municipal level, for instance, we are really already seeing the impact of renewables on the pricing and the need to review the pricing structure and rates that are being implemented. One key element is the issue of a backup tariff. So when you talk about a backup tariff, we are referring to those customers that would have installed, for instance, rooftop solar, but they will still then require backup power from the grid when the sun is not shining, depending on the level of storage they have in terms of batteries and all of that. So that tariff there then ensures that a utility, distributors, even Eskom as well, is still able to then still be able to recover the costs. As I mentioned previously, that the cost of supplying electricity are not dependent on the amount of electricity. So then these customers will still then need to contribute. So what we've seen is that utilities, including Eskom, have been sort of trying to unbundle their tariffs and sort of splitting the variable element from the fixed element, mainly to deal with the issue of customers taking up solar, and then they will still need to then access the grid as backup, so that at least they are still able to contribute to their fixed costs, because as long as they are connected to the grid, the utility still needs to be able to provide that backup power through the transformers, the lines, the reticulation, and the metering, and all the infrastructure that is related to providing that capacity still needs to be paid for. So that's what we are seeing, and consumers have seen this sort of as a penalty for sort of penalizing customers who install solar, but that is not generally the intention. So what, from the point of view of the regulator, what we have done was to try to say, for instance, Eskom came to the regulator to propose to restructure some of their tariffs, including in introducing a basic charge for customers with solar. So what we are saying, that let's try and look at the way to balancing this need. As much as there is a need to recover the fixed costs, there's also a need to balance it in terms of impact on consumers. So the issue of cost structure and solar and vis-a-vis other renewable energy, vis-a-vis other generating technologies also impacts on the pricing, in the sense that what you see is that over time now there is a need then to ensure that, if, for instance, particular distributors, that they have proper charges for wheeling, because what we are seeing is that there's a lot of trading that is going to happen, and that is already happening, where a customer or an off-taker that sits somewhere in Gauteng signs an off-take agreement with a generator that sits somewhere in the Northern Cape, or anywhere where they are higher renewable sources, then that means that they will use the network then to generate this electricity. So we are seeing more and more distributors trying to then also develop these wheeling tariffs that will allow them then to then provide these distribution services. So the renewable component then also would then, because now the issue around the intermittency then affects also the time of use, in a sense that when customers then come back, they might actually come back when the tariff is quite high, as I spoke about time of use rates between winter and summer. But then there's an opportunity for them when they then feed into a grid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bongani. I think what really becomes, or what gets highlighted more than anything, is that these costs, or costs associated with generation or just provision of this electricity, at the end of the day, do have an impact on ordinary South Africans. And I think perhaps those who are then hardest hit by costs of electricity, or electricity generation and electricity pricing, are really then low income households. Frank, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation here in terms of just unpacking or looking at what are the steps that are or that can be taken in order to mitigate the impact of high electricity prices on low income households.
Yes, thank you once again, Thokozile, for the question. There's a lot of instruments that are available out there, but let me speak to mainly three. And the first one being that in the case of municipal entities or entities that are in the distribution of electricity, including Eskom, the primary instrument for mitigating against high cost electricity for customers is the provision of free basic electricity. In terms of this, the qualifying low-income households have been given free electricity that could range from 50 kilowatt hours to 150 kilowatt hours a month. That is not being charged for to the customer. And how we pay for that is that the national government gives municipal entities equitable share, which is part of the revenue share formula that the government has, and that equitable share, part of it is to be used for the payment for the provision of free basic electricity.
Thank you very much, Frank. Nhlanhla, I'd like to come back to you and maybe continuing from what you touched on discussing in relation to the court judgment that's now, re-looking at methodologies that are then going to be used by municipalities in determining electricity pricing. I'd like to unpack or discuss the role that public consultation can play in setting electricity prices, if any, and how do municipalities then gather and incorporate feedback from residents? Does it always need to get to a court case, or are there actually channels in place for the public to provide feedback?
Well, this is an interesting question because recently we've seen the courts playing more and more bigger roles in the affairs of the industry. So I think maybe as the practitioners, we need to start, putting our house in order and not have our, industry being, controlled or instructed by courts from time to time. But obviously we're a democratic country, so sometimes courts are also part of this democracy. So maybe we should not also frown upon that. We have a thriving democracy, and that's a good thing to have as well. So in terms of consultation, going back to my earlier statement, municipalities, according to the law, Financial Management Act, they are supposed to also set their own tariffs, and there's a process for them to do that. They go through an entire consultative process in their jurisdiction, which includes people, the meetings, imbizos, that the mayors have with the people doing consultations, and maybe even showing or sharing with the people the indicative tariff that they want to have in the the forthcoming years, for electricity and other services. But also there, and they will complete that process and agree, or maybe I should say agree, inverted commas, with the communities that this is the tariff that the municipality will charge to the people coming, in the next financial year. But now there comes the process of NERSA, which is not linked whatsoever with the Municipal Finance Management Act process. NERSA also is empowered by the Electricity Regulation Act to set tariff and regulate tariffs for all licenses, which municipalities are part of those licenses. Then you have NERSA with its own regulatory framework, determining, what could be an average tariff in municipalities. And in most cases, there's a mismatch with what has been consulted for by the municipality with its people and what NERSA is determining as an average tariff through its benchmark methodology. So that creates a bit of a problem and a bit of an unrest for municipalities, because you would find that at some point they have engaged with the people and consulted with the people, and although maybe the price that they would want to set becomes a pain for the people, but people would end up maybe trying to swallow what the municipality is presenting to them. Then there comes the NERSA process, which actually takes the entire issue to another direction, which creates a bit of an issue for municipalities. So I think, your question is, do I think that consultation process works? It's not an easy question to say yes or no, because also I might sound like I'm going at NERSA, but I'm not. I'm being realistic. NERSA also takes its own processes or decisions on consultation, especially when it comes to municipal tariffs. And those consultations, usually there's a lot of citizens and even the municipalities that come and present the positions there. But more times than not, you find that you become discouraged as the time goes, because you come there, you make the noise, and you don't really see what you made in the consultation processes being considered in the entire governance process of the tariffs in municipalities. So it becomes almost like a tick box process, a compliance process, if you might, which is discouraging people. I can tell you, recently in the past 2 to 5 years back, the amount of people you get on consultations have deteriorated quite substantially. And I think it's because people become, they lose faith in the process. They say, we come here and tell them we can't afford this. We are losing customers because of 1, 2, 3. This increase is way above the inflation and many other issues that we put as positions. But you find that the decision obviously don't consider some of those things. Obviously, you understand here there's a dilemma because the regulator also must be able to give or offer the tariff that it's going to allow the utility to cover its cost and get a profit over and above that. So you have this situation, you have socio-economic issues where we're sitting as municipalities, and then you have NESA that needs to balance between making sure that the utilities like Eskom and others are still sustainable. They can still recover their costs and also get a reasonable return. That is a big problem in terms of balancing what kind of price signals should we be having, because we have the industry that is not currently sustainable because of tariffs that are not cost reflective. And these utilities or this industry needs to catch up with the global prices. And then you've got the people who are poor and not working, or who are low income households, who are looking at these high increases and looking at the salaries that they have, which is, the disposable income that they have. They look at things like your electricity, your food, and services. And in most cases, the services become the last thing they think about, because the first thing they think about is what must go to the stomach. Must take the kids to school. I must pay for the transport for umalume to take my kids to school. All these other things, these social things that people have to really look at before they think about, oh, I have to pay for water as well. I have to pay for electricity as well. And because now that becomes so unaffordable, people end up saying, okay, I'm going to pay part of the bill, or maybe not at all. And I'm saying this not in any way condoning that people must not pay. I'm just trying to paint a picture of the reality we have in this country around the issues of electricity prices and where they need to go. Let me maybe end it there. But I think in terms of consultation, there can be no, simple yes or no answer. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But in most times, recently, we find ourselves that consultation doesn't work and only the unrest works. And that's not a good thing to have. We should try and do things better as the sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I guess, there's a balancing act. There's socioeconomic development issues that need to be considered. There's a transforming or rapidly transforming electricity industry with this move from a vertically integrated monopoly to a liberalized competitive market, which as what's being explained, or how the public is being informed around this, is that the liberalization of the South African electricity supply industry will actually result in lower prices for customers, or that there's actually going to be a benefit for consumers from that perspective. Dr. Bongani, I was wondering if you can maybe just come in here and just unpack how will the liberalization of the South African electricity sector actually impact electricity pricing?
Thanks for the question. So look, from where I'm sitting, there won't be any immediate benefit in terms of prices going down. And the reason is that Eskom is still generally the biggest supplier of electricity. So the unbundling, the process there is to then separate transmission which will have an independent systems operator, the trader, as well as the trading platform. So the only time then we'll start seeing prices going down is when we have a market where we have more generators that are able to produce electricity cheaper than Eskom, and are able to auction or whatever process they will use to bid for prices. Then only then you will start seeing the impact on prices. But generally, for now, where we are in terms of the unbundling, the separation of Eskom and having a separate transmission company, to a certain extent, it will start sort of providing the transparency in terms of the different divisions. Because in the past, what you used to see was that because there was no clear separation of generation, transmission, and distribution in terms of the ring fencing of the accounts, the income statements, the balance sheet, there was a lot of cross subsidization that would occur between the divisions. So Eskom would come to NESA, and NESA will make a determination, and then they will then, based on the rationalization that they need to do, then allocate through each division. But now with a separate transmission company, they need to stand on their own. So they need to show that this is what it costs to transmit electricity, and they need to have a fully unbundled tariff. Then that will allow them to recover their costs. That's one benefit. And then at the same time, then hopefully they'll be more efficient for now. So that's the main benefit. But over time, yes, once we have more generators coming into the market through different processes, either through next round of bidding or auctioning or whatever process that will be there, then we'll have, from the generation point of view, start seeing prices going down. But from transmission distribution, I think you will still have a system where you have a natural monopoly, because I don't really see us having wires running all over the place and having different distribution suppliers. So in the long run, it will then start then showing us those benefits. Once we have a market, currently we don't really have a market from the generation point of view. Thanks, Thokozi.
Thank you very much for that. Frank, a point, and I want to bring you back into the conversation. A point that Nhlanhla made earlier was around cross subsidies. What are the implications of cross subsidies within electricity tariff structures from different customer classes, and how does that actually work when you're considering residential, commercial, and industrial customers?
Thank you for the question. Cross subsidization. You see, we have got the electricity pricing policy now, which is of which the government is custodian, and the regulator and the regulated entities are to ensure that it gets implemented to the extent that it's possible. Now, in terms of that policy, it then says electricity customers must be subjected to cost-reflective tariffs. In other words, every customer category must be responsible for their share of what they contribute to the cost of operating a utility that provides electricity. And such charges must be based on a cost of supply study findings. Therefore, utilities are required to have cost of supply studies every so often, around 4 or 5 times. I mean, every 5 years at least. Now, but the same policy allows, however, that allows for mitigation for justifiable cross-subsidization between customer categories, mainly from large power users customers to residential customers. And you could have various classes of residential customers depending on affordability. So, for as much as customers must be subjected to cost-reflective tariff, the same policy also allows for justifiable cross-subsidization. Now, what that means is that certain customer categories, particularly residential, particularly the lower income or the indigents amongst the residential customers, will not be expected to pay a tariff that is fully reflective of the cost of providing the service to them. The policy allows for them to be charged less, provided that can be recovered from the larger user customers, so that the utility is not negatively affected by that. Now, that is referred to as cross-subsidization. So usually you can therefore afford to charge larger customers tariffs with a charge residential customers tariffs that are slightly below the cost of supplying them, and cross-subsidize that from charges to larger customers. And it can be done and must be done in a way that the impact on the larger customers is not too significant, especially given that the large customers normally have take large quantities of electricity, and therefore the element of cross-subsidization must be managed in a way that it is it does not adversely affect the large customer, especially when considering the fact that the volumes that they use. Now, it also means that, so therefore, it is then aimed to ensure that electricity remains affordable to the most vulnerable members of society through this cross-subsidization mechanism. But the policy is also very clear that such cross-subsidization must be done in a transparent way. So customers must know that the extent to which they are cross-subsidizing other customer categories. But other, so that to the extent that if there is a 2 cents added to the cost of supplying a large customer, for purposes of cross-subsidizing the other customers, that large power user must know to say that out of the 250 that is being charged for electricity supply, how much of it actually goes towards cross-subsidization of other customer categories. So therefore, through that, the cost of electricity is been reduced to the affected residential customers, while it is known to the larger users that are subsidizing the extent to which they are subsidizing. And that is mainly aimed at ensuring that there is a balance at the end of the day, because the one customer's ability to subsidize the other customer is not unlimited, and therefore has to be managed carefully. At the same time, the recipient would want as much of the price to be subsidized as possible, hence the need to draw a balance between the two. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Frank. That I'd like to bring you back into the conversation and just touching on or continuing from the point that you'd made around the fact that Eskom and municipalities actually have different pricing methodologies. It, for me, just highlights or speaks to the fact that there may be a misalignment in terms of how South Africa's electricity supply industry is actually working. And I'd like you to please explain then the impact of national energy policies on local electricity pricing and how municipalities actually align or adapt to those policies.
Yeah, no, this is a difficult one. Yeah, I think there is, you're totally right, there is a mismatch. There is, although, you know, an electricity pricing policy, which should be setting the scene for electricity pricing in South Africa. But unfortunately, obviously, because of how the industry has been set up, it's made it impossible for NERSA to actually regulate the industry using the same kind of regulatory framework in terms of tariffs. But now, because there's a lot of developments that are taking place in the sector, energy transition is coming, renewable energy, also investments that are also part of the government policy, they are coming. But if we want to attract more investment, we need to make sure that we make it to make sense for an international investor. So that in its own way is going to, you know, make it very difficult for, you know, the tariffs to be aligned to the policy when the policy is looking for affordability and sustainability and all those other things that are trying to protect the you know, the poor class, or say, let's say the low income class and maybe the people who are not working. So it's very, very important for the entire industry now to go towards having the same regulatory framework, because you know, the oncoming market that is going to be in operation very soon is going to make things a little even more complicated, because the municipalities must very fast know how much it costs to actually offer the distribution services or the distribution network services, which at this point, not all of them know that. And you might find once they know how much it is to offer network services, the tariff that they might charge might actually double or triple. But and that might be a tariff that makes sense for the market to operate sustainably. So I'm just making an example. I don't want to be a fearmonger and maybe for people out there at home to think, oh, we're going to have tariffs tripling. We might have tariffs staying where they are or even maybe becoming low. But like Dr. Has said, I don't think the market will have an impact on tariffs becoming a little bit lower. I think in the beginning of the market, the tariffs might become a little bit more higher because that is where we are trying to attract more participants in the market. Maybe at some point now, when you have a lot or when you have more competition in the system or in the market, that's where you might start having those participants that might bid a little bit lower than the others. And that actually, but still, it might not necessarily lower the price of transporting electricity because you have fixed assets that you are using. Whether the generation part of things is becoming even 10 cents per kilowatt hour. But if it was 2 rands per kilowatt hour to transport power, it's not going to change because the electricity generation just became widely lower. So we might see the industry prices becoming a little bit sharper and go higher, maybe in the beginning of the market, maybe stabilize as the time goes. And I don't think that would be 100% aligned to the government policy, because the government policy is twofold. There's a pricing policy that talks about sustainability of the utilities themselves and affordability. So it's twofold. The utilities must be sustainable, and also they must look at affordability part of it. So to balance those two things, especially within this transition, is going to be a job and a half. But I think it's something that we will slowly go towards, achieving as the sector. But yeah, I think the short and end of it at this point in time, because the energy policy is trying to spike up more development and more investment, I think in terms of what it seeks to achieve on pricing, there might be a mismatch there, because obviously we want to get more investors, and to get more investors, the price must make sense for them. The rate of return must make sense for them. And that doesn't necessarily mean affordability. So the municipalities still will have to sit with the balancing act in terms of setting tariffs that could have some form of cross-subsidization within the customers themselves. Maybe bigger customers, like it's happening right now, there's a component of them cross-subsidizing the poor in the tariff. And then the block of the poor would have a lesser price in terms of a kilowatt or rent per kilowatt hour, because obviously someone else has paid the price for them. But is this a right thing to have? If I was in business, I would say no, because I'm there to make money and I'm charged for other people's, I'm charged more so that I can actually subsidize the people, who are not paying. And I understand if I'm subsidizing the poor people, but the percentage at most now that we are subsidizing is the people who are not paying. We are subsidizing utilities to be more sustainable by charging the bigger customer more, so that they still stay afloat. And that is not an efficient way of doing things in the sector. And that is why we really need, as the citizens, to start really taking it serious, that a service that you have consumed is a service that you need to pay for. There's nothing for free. Even if there is something such as free basic electricity policy that is out there. But people must know there's no such thing as free. For this free basic electricity policy to work, someone else must pay the price. And in this instant, it's the middle class, the working class, and the business that are paying the price for that. So if you are getting free electricity, it's not because the country can give you free electricity. It's because someone else must feel the pinch for you to get those free kilowatt hours. So people have to be more educated around how does the system of the energy utility or the municipality work, because the municipalities are not getting funded like a provincial government where every year there's going to be X billions that are given to the province to look at things of human settlement, your other services, health, etc. Municipalities' funding model is that they actually use the revenue they collect from the people to actually run their systems. And right now, that's not working quite well because people are not paying. I mean, earlier on, I was in an interview with TV, and they asked me about Tshwane, who was doing very well in the past few years. Right now, Tshwane is collecting 60% of what it sells to the people of the capital. So 40% of the people are culprits. They are not paying. And the question is why? And I don't know the answer to that. But for the longest time, it's becoming a culture that you don't want to pay for what we consume. I'll end it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I guess, the question, or the questions people aren't paying, and the question is, why are they not paying? And I think a lot of South Africans are greatly discouraged, have greatly disengaged from the sector because, you're struggling with situations where you're paying for a service, as you've rightly said, but then you are dealing with challenges such as load shedding. And I'm not saying that that's what all South Africans are feeling, or that's what's driving South Africans to not necessarily pay for their electricity. But I think it becomes important to then consider the fact that there is, as you're saying, a continuous increase in electricity tariffs for a service, but a service that can then be interrupted without notice. But I think what South Africans then are wondering, or the concern is, why is electricity pricing still the same if we've been struggling with so much load shedding? What am I in fact paying for? And I think, Dr. Bongani, it then begs the question, what impact, if any, does load shedding have on electricity pricing?
Thanks, Tel, for the question. Yes, we certainly get a lot of questions around why is my bill not going down whilst there's so much load shedding. There are a number of reasons. So the first one I did mention previously was the fact that the cost of supplying electricity is not really dependent on the amount, or a bigger portion of that is not really dependent on the amount that you consume. So 60 to 70% of that is fixed. But depending on the type of tariff that you are on, you might actually see more of a variable component vis-a-vis maybe a large power user that will have a more unbundled tariff. So generally, that's what would affect the price that you pay for electricity. But so what happened was that there were questions that were asked by stakeholders in previously when NESA went for public hearings to say, we have this asset that you are saying that it's generating so much, but it's not performing where it's supposed to be. So the last time I checked, the current energy availability factor was sitting at around 58%, and vis-a-vis a standard of about 70 to 75%. But at the same time, you are also you want to earn a return on this asset. So one of the biggest cost drivers for Eskom in the last MIPD was the return on assets. Even though they apply for a negative return, they will then also apply for a very high depreciation on those assets. And the asset values actually increased from about 800 billion to about 1.4 trillion over the period. And then the question was then to say, we have this asset, but it's not performing where it's supposed to be. So the EAF is low, which leads to load shedding. Why should we then be allowed a full return? And so it's something that we've seen that it does being implemented, like for instance in the US, where the return that is allowable will be adjusted for the plant availability. But when NESA tried to implement this one, then it was taken on review by Eskom and they were successful. And I think the ground for them being successful, the main one was the fact that it was not provided for in the current MYPD methodology. So it's something that maybe the regulator will have to look at, because this is a question to say, why am I paying more every year, but there's load shedding? But another element to it, is the issue of, so for instance, if you look at how people then use their appliances. So if, for instance, you know that you will be load shed at 6 to 8, you will then shift your load, maybe you cook earlier, which then effectively would then be affected either by the price that you will then pay. Maybe if you cook from off peak to peak or whatever the case may be, it might affect the price that you pay. Although time of use tariffs for mostly residential customers, they are not implemented, but where they are, it would then also affect that. And also, if you look at what happens when load shedding ends, you'll find that customers will start, or they will start charging their batteries, inverters, and they will just increase the load. So whatever benefit you would have accrued from load shedding, or whatever reduction in your consumption during load shedding, might actually be affected by the time then you start trying to catch up and then trying to then balance this. So what happens is that, so when Eskom then calculates, so there is an account that we could refer to as the revenue clearing account for Eskom, where then they will say that they would have expected to incur so much in terms of various cost elements, but then there was a variance for one reason or the other, then they will bring that to NESA. So Eskom will then say adjust that for load shedding to say any variances in their revenues, ultimately their costs that arise from load shedding would not be recovered from customers. But the challenge now is that at the same time, their costs are fixed. They still need to be able to pay for whatever money they borrowed to build the assets. And then, so at the end of the day, it's sort of a difficult decision to balance this need of saying customers should not be penalized for load shedding. At the same time, you then have Eskom that then needs to still recover their fixed costs. So this impact would also, for instance, we've seen that agricultural customers they do to benefit. There is a tariff that is called Night Safe. So what they would do, they would irrigate at night because of a cheaper tariff. And now, but because of load shedding that happens during the night, they ended up having to do irrigation and other activities that they would have done at night during the day or any other time when power is available. Then that affects their bottom line, their cost structure, and all of that. So effectively, they end up paying more. And for them, it's a double whammy because you have load shedding, which sort of, from the operational point of view, inconveniences you. At the same time, you also need to now shift your load to other times where there's power, but then your tariff is saying that you should be irrigating at night. So those are the other dynamics that also would then affect or impact on the prices because of load shedding. So thank you, Thokoza.
Thank you very much for that. I think very insightful and really does answer a question that a lot of South Africans are grappling with in terms of still paying the same price for electricity, but yet you don't actually have access to electricity due to load shedding. I think this episode and just the insights that have really been shared has really been enlightening in terms of unpacking principles and unpacking concepts that are very important for South Africans to actually understand. It's very important that I think also that South Africans also we're able to be in a position to take ownership of ensuring that we also meet our obligations, of ensuring that we are paying for electricity, because I think, as explained, the knock-on effect of non-payments then just ends up exasperating the problem. And that really brings us to the end of this installment of the Energy Conversations podcast. I want to extend my sincere gratitude to our esteemed guests for sharing their invaluable insights and expertise. Today, we continued the journey to demystify South Africa's energy landscape and empower ordinary South African citizens. Join us next time as we continue our exploration. Until then, remember that the power to change our energy future lies with each of us. Thank you for tuning in, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe, and let's shape South Africa's energy future together.